Okay, imagine this. Something orbiting Earth right now, silently. Not ours, maybe. Maybe not even from our time. Like this enigma just hanging up there in the black, possibly watching us for, I don't know, thousands of years.
Sounds science fiction.
It totally does.
Right.
But that's kind of the core idea behind this whole Black Knight satellite conspiracy theory.
Right.
So today, on the deep dive, we're going to dig into a bunch of sources we found, Wikipedia articles, a pretty detailed space news piece, even some video descriptions in a couple of languages.
Yeah, trying to piece it together.
Exactly. We want to get to the bottom of this legend for you. We're asking, what is this Black Knight thing really? What's the so-called evidence? And crucially, what do space experts actually say?
What's the scientific take?
Yeah. Okay, let's get into it.
It's kind of amazing how this one theory pulls together so many different threads, things that don't seem connected at first glance.
Right.
The absolute core of the Black Knight idea is this belief in an extraterrestrial spacecraft, an alien ship. And it's supposedly in what they call a near-polar orbit, circling Earth near the poles.
Okay.
And the really big claim, the conspiracy part, is that organizations like NASA are basically hiding it, covering up that it exists and that it's alien.
Wow.
But what's fascinating, like you said, is it's not one single story. It feels more like a collection of different incidents, different interpretations that have sort of clumped together over the years.
And it's not just some recent internet thing either, is it? Some of this stuff goes way back before we even launched anything.
That's absolutely right. The roots go deep. Some believers, they point back to Nikola Tesla way back in 1899.
Tesla, really?
Yeah. He reported picking up these repeating radio signals during his experiments. He wondered, could they be from somewhere else? But later on, science kind of offered other possibilities.
Oh, like what?
Well, things like pulsars, for instance. Those weren't discovered until, 1968. Rapidly spinning stars sending out radiation.
Ah, okay.
Or, it could have just been interference from right here on Earth. That happens.
Okay, interesting. Then there were those long-delayed echoes you hear about from the 1920s. That sounds spooky.
It really does. So this was amateur radio operators, starting with a guy named Jürgen Hals in Norway back in 1928. They were noticing their own signals, bouncing back, but after a really long delay, unexpectedly long.
Weird.
Super weird. And then in 1973, the scientist, Duncan Lunan, he analyzed these echoes, and he came up with this, pretty wild theory.
Which was?
That these echoes could be signals from an alien probe, maybe 13,000 years old, possibly from the Epsilon Deutus star system.
13,000 years. Whoa.
Yeah. But Lunan himself later said, nope, retract that. He called his own methods unscientific, admitted there were outright errors.
Huh. So the guy who put that piece on the board basically took it back later.
Pretty much, yeah. That definitely changes the perspective on that piece of evidence.
Okay. So what about things closer to, the actual space age? I think I read something about the U.S. Air Force spotting stuff in the 50s.
Yeah, that comes up too. In 1954, there was this UFO researcher, Donald Keyhoe. He wrote books on UFOs. That was his thing.
Right.
He claimed in newspapers that the Air Force had detected 2 satellites orbiting Earth. Now remember, this was before anyone had launched anything.
So impossible at the time.
Technically, yeah. No nation had that capability yet. So there's always been a lot of skepticism. Was he maybe hyping things up to sell books? Hard to say for sure, but the timing is suggestive.
Makes sense. And then what about that Time magazine report in 1960? That sounds a bit more official.
It does. February 1960, Time magazine reported the U.S. Navy spotted a dark object in orbit.
A dark object.
Yeah. And the initial thought was, maybe it's a Soviet spy satellite. Because of the Cold War context, right? It's definitely added fuel to the fire for people thinking something unknown was up there. But then a follow-up report clarified things. It wasn't mysterious. It was identified as debris. Specifically, wreckage from the U.S. Air Force's Discoverer 8 satellite. It had gone off course.
So our own junk again.
Exactly. One of the sources we looked at, the Vietnamese Wikipedia entry, actually mentions this too. And it even gives some orbital details, like a 79-degree inclination, an orbit taking about 104.5 minutes.
Okay.
And it was an elliptical orbit. Not perfectly circular. These are exactly the kinds of details you'd expect from a piece of early American space hardware, not some, ancient alien thing.
Right. A classic case of mistaken identity with early space debris.
Okay, but now we get to the stuff that really grabs people, I think. The claims from inside the space program. Like astronaut Gordon Cooper supposedly seeing a UFO.
Ah, yes, the Gordon Cooper story. That's a big one in the Black Knight lore.
What's the claim exactly?
The story goes that Cooper, on his Mercury 9 flight in 1963, specifically on his 15th orbit, saw a UFO. And not only that, but the sighting was supposedly confirmed by tracking stations on the ground.
Wow, okay. If true, that's huge. If true, yes. But the consensus among researchers, and this is pointed out in the main Wikipedia source we have, is that there's just no proof. Nothing in the official NASA mission transcripts, nothing in Cooper's own personal flight records, no mention of it anywhere reliable.
So likely just a story that got attached to him.
Seems that way. It persists, but the evidence isn't there.
Okay. And that brings us to maybe the most famous piece of evidence, that photo. The STS-88 picture from the shrine.
No, yeah, that photo. This is probably the image most people associate with the Black Knight today. It's visually very compelling.
So what's the context? 1998.
Yep, 1998.
Yeah.
Space Shuttle mission STS-88. This was a really important mission, the first one to link up the American and Russian parts of what would become the International Space Station.
Yeah.
And during that mission, NASA released photos taken by the astronauts showing this dark, kind of weirdly shaped object floating nearby.
And people immediately said,
"That's it. That's the Black Knight." Believers saw it as proof positive. Finally, a clear picture.
But NASA had an explanation, didn't they? A much more mundane one.
They did, a very mundane one. Astronaut Jerry Ross, who was on that mission and did the spacewalks, has been very clear about it.
What did he say was?
A thermal blanket, just a piece of insulation that got away during a spacewalk.
A blanket. Seriously. It looks so solid, almost metallic in the photos.
Well, Ross explained, and the Space News article quotes him, these covers were needed to wrap connection points called trunnion tins to stop heat escaping while they were joining the U.S. module, Unity, to the Russian module, Zarya.
Okay.
And apparently, the mission commander, Robert Cabana, even radioed Ross during the spacewalk something like, "Hey, I think one of those covers came loose," so it was noted at the time.
And it wasn't just like their word for it, right? Did they track this thing?
They did. NASA actually cataloged the lost blanket, gave it an official object number, 025570, and they tracked its orbit until just a few days later, it fell back into the atmosphere and burned up. Gone.
Okay, that sounds pretty definitive.
And there's more confirmation. James Oberg, he's a really respected space journalist and historian. Used to work at NASA Mission Control, actually.
Oh, wait, I got the name.
He knew Jerry Ross. And he also knew Sergei Krikalev, the cosmonaut who took the pictures. Oberg investigated this thoroughly.
And his conclusion?
Absolutely a thermal blanket. He explains in that Space News piece how things can look really bizarre in space. The lighting, the lack of atmosphere, no background for scale. It can make ordinary objects look unearthly, as he put it.
That makes sense. You don't have the usual visual cues.
Exactly. And Oberg also pointed out something interesting mentioned in that article about how sometimes old NASA web links to photos break over time.
Yeah.
And people jump on that shouting, "Cover up, they're hiding the evidence."
Oh, I see.
But Oberg makes the point that it often just comes down to, websites changing, things not being maintained. And crucially, he notes a lack of basic journalistic legwork, sometimes people not checking timelines, not actually contacting the astronauts involved before declaring it a conspiracy.
Right. Just jumping to conclusions based on a strange picture and a broken link.
Precisely. And, all this really leads to a key understanding of the Black Knight legend itself. It's not one thing, it's messy. Martina Redpath from Armagh Planetarium summed it up perfectly, according to Wikipedia. She called it a jumble of completely unrelated stories, chopped up, stirred together, and stewed on the internet.
So like a myth built from spare parts, taking Tesla signals, the LDEs, the 1960 debris, the STS-88 blanket.
Exactly, mashing them all together, even though they have separate, explainable origins to create this bigger, more mysterious narrative.
Okay, so it's this mix of different stories. What about that claim you mentioned earlier that it's super old, like 13,000 years old? Where does that specific number come from?
Yeah, that number pops up a lot. It really seems tied back to Duncan Loonan's original interpretation of those long-delayed echoes.
The one he later retracted.
Yeah, the very same. His initial theory suggested decoding the echo delays revealed a star map pointing to Epsilon Bodas, and he calculated the probes sending them must be around 13,000 years old. Even though he took it back, that number stuck in the mythology.
Got it.
The Vietnamese source also mentions a similar figure, 12,600 years, linked to Loonan's analysis of those signals Halls picked up in Norway. And sometimes you see even more speculative links trying to tie it to ancient myths, like Sumerian watchers being aliens. But the sources we looked at don't really detail those much.
So mostly stemming from that retracted science.
Largely, yes, for that specific age claim.
Okay. So let's just recap the counterarguments then when we look at each piece of this evidence.
There seem to be pretty solid, scientific or historical explanations for just about all of it.
Right. Tesla's signals.
Probably natural radio sources like pulsars or maybe just earthly interference.
The 1960 dark object in polar orbit.
Identified pretty clearly as debris from the Discoverer 8 satellite, our own space program's leftovers.
And the STS-88 photo, the really famous one.
Overwhelmingly likely, based on astronaut testimony, tracking data, and expert analysis, to be just that lost thermal blanket.
It really seems like, as that space news article suggests, things like confirmation bias play a big role here.
Absolutely. People want to believe in something extraordinary, so they interpret ambiguous data like a weird photo in a way that fits the narrative they prefer. And you combine that with just the power of a good story, a good myth, especially one that taps into our fascination with space and maybe a little bit of distrust towards official explanations.
Right, it's a potent mix.
It really is. It creates fertile ground for these kinds of theories to grow and spread, especially online. And having that visual, that STS-88 photo, even knowing what it likely is, gives it a kind of tangible hook that makes the whole idea feel more real. Visuals are powerful.
So, okay, we've done this deep dive, looked at the sources, and it feels like the Black Knight satellite conspiracy, while it's definitely a cool, captivating idea.
It seems to be more of a patchwork quilt, really. Made from misinterpreted events, unrelated stories, maybe some hoaxes thrown in, rather than actual solid proof of an alien artifact.
That really seems to be the main takeaway here.
Yeah, the idea of some ancient, mysterious watcher in the sky. It's incredibly compelling. It hits something deep, I think.
Totally.
But when you scrutinize the specific claims, look at the timelines, the technical details, the scientific explanations just seem much more plausible. Like with the Discoverer 8 debris, those orbital details, the 79-degree inclination, the 104-minute period, that fits perfectly with the U.S. satellite fragment from that time. It doesn't fit something maintaining a stable orbit for thousands of years. Those details matter.
Right. And that term near polar orbit, too, it sounds mysterious, but you mentioned why that was significant back then.
Well, yeah, it just means an orbit that passes close to the North and South poles. And that kind of orbit was, and still is, often used for reconnaissance or spy satellites. Which is exactly why, back in 1960, the first guess was Soviet spy satellite. It fit the expected profile for man-made objects of the time.
Gotcha, okay. So while that image of a 13,000-year-old alien satellite is probably going to keep firing up people's imaginations,
the actual evidence we've looked at really points towards much more down-to-earth origins for all the different bits and pieces of this legend.
it really does. It makes you think, though, even if the Black Knight itself, as this ancient alien thing, seems really unlikely based on everything we've discussed, what is the fact that these stories persist, that they're so popular? What does that tell us about ourselves? About maybe our deep-seated desire for mystery, for the unknown, especially when we look out into space?